This is the Pepperwood Podcast, a production of Pepperwood, a nonprofit conservation organization based at a 3,200-acre nature reserve near Santa Rosa, California, in the heart of the traditional homeland of the Wapo people. At Pepperwood, we aim to inspire conservation through science. And on this show, we talk to scientists, stewards, and environmental educators about what they do and how they do it. We hope to give you a glimpse into the real experiences of folks who devote their lives to taking care of local ecosystems and sharing them with others. Welcome back to the Pepperwood Podcast. This is Season 2, Episode 2, and we're going to dive into some science. We do an immense amount of data collection and analysis here at Pepperwood, creating long-term data sets that help us monitor what is happening on the landscape to better understand how things are changing through time. That can ultimately help us determine what kind of stewardship work might be the most effective in preserving the rich biodiversity that we so value in our local ecosystems. Today, we're going to highlight the monitoring of abiotic elements, non-living components of the ecosystems. These can be crucial influences on the biotic or living components like the plants, animals, fungi, you get it. Tracking abiotic conditions helps us understand what might drive changes in plant and animal populations. Spearheading much of Pepperwood's abiotic data collection is today's guest, Ryan Farrell. Ryan grew up in Santa Rosa, and he went to UC Davis as both an undergrad and a graduate student. He got his master's in science in soils and biogeochemistry, so an abiotic guy from way back. Ryan is now our Sentinel Site manager, and I started off by asking him what exactly that means.
The short history is I started out as a research technician and then a research scientist, and today they call me the Sentinel Site manager up here. I still feel like it's a big title that, like, what does that really mean? And I always tell everybody, like, it's a whole lot of things, which is more the nature of Pepperwood. But related to the science, I often consider myself the abiotic guy, like think sensors and telemetry networks, so like radios, and there's different kinds of radios. How do we get the data back? So hydrology, soils, and arguments could be made throughout all those disciplines that, like, oh, there's biology involved as well. And that's the case with the natural world. You can't really focus on one discipline and just live in that silo because there's so many things that interact across that divide. But in a nutshell, that's most of my science job up here, is keeping all that data flowing. And certainly, as Michelle Halber has said, we wear a lot of hats up here at Pepperwood. So I'm always getting tapped to get in on the ecology and the biological side of things. And then stewardship as well. And that's science too. We try to implement that adaptive management plan. So I tell people it's my job to put the numbers to the management. And so we make essentially data-informed management decisions and complete that loop. Like, hey, we were trying to do this. Did we accomplish this? No. Why not? How would we change that? And so it's my job, at least I tell myself and everybody else, to gather those numbers so that we can then, make informed decisions about our stewardship moving forward.
What are some of the actual parameters? What are some of the data points that you're catching?
All right, so the big one, and maybe there's a bias in here, but the soils and hydrology, and they interact together because so often the water is within the soils, and that's the medium that the roots are tapped into, so our plant life is tapped into, that the biology and the wildlife feed on. But the hydrology metric, I like to think of things at the watershed scale and landscape level because, it's so dynamic. I often say you could throw a rock in any direction up here and be in a completely different micro ecosystem or environment. But if you integrate all that chaos and heterogeneity and opportunity together at the bottom end of that watershed, as defined by one thing, topography, you get a value of flow. How much water is exiting that system? And that value has to do with all the interactions of what's going on up above. So you're not sort of lost in the weeds. You can zoom way out and okay, what does all of this produce? And that's that hydrologic flow measurement. How do we measure that stream flow? We use fixed geometry weirs. It's like weirs or flumes. In this case, it's a 90-degree V-notch weir that has a bunch of empirical data behind it and rating curves. Like, hey, if the water is X inches high, 4 inches high, going through this geometry, and you meet these conditions, laminar flow, then we know the flow is this. And then all the way up through those heights of water going over, the equation matches it. So
can I just pause and say what a weir looks like? If you stumbled upon it, what would it look like in the wild?
You'd be rock hopping down the creek, probably looking down, looking for dicamptodons and other cool stuff in the creek bed. And all of a sudden,
giant salamanders.
Yeah. All of a sudden, you'd walk into a huge concrete wall and be like, "Oh my God, where did this come from? Who put this here? What is this?" And it's it can be a little alarming, I suppose. But I promise, we got the permits from California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Lake and Stream Bed Alteration Agreements, and the Water Quality Control Board, and they were all thrilled with the idea because up here in the mountaintops, this is where floods are born. It's where you get most of the precipitation, and lower in the Santa Rosa Plain, when you get flooding and this and that, it's important to know, well, what's going on up there, because that determines what happens down here. So anyways, putting these structures in.
So it's kind of a wall,
Yep.
but it's a partial wall that has like a very geometric gap
Yes,
that allows
yes.
water to pass through. And then using that gap, you can use that to sort of triangulate the amount of flow. Is that accurate?
Yes. There's a pressure transducer. It's a sensor. It measures the height of water. And based on that high water, you know how much water is going over the structure, the weir. And from there, you just apply the equation, and that converts that stage or depth of water into a flow.
So do you have to go manually check that, or is that transducer sort of automatically?
Automatic, collecting in real time every 15 minutes. So we get pretty solid.
So the amount of
set.
water that's moving through this creek is being monitored every 15 minutes.
Every 15 minutes. And up here, given the atmospheric rivers and even the slow base flows, this dynamic place, the point measurements would be one-off in time, would be so difficult
snapshot that would have nothing, that would have no relationship to the way water moves through on a regular basis.
So you can see with that 15-minute data on those sensors and loggers, you get the perfect curve of here comes the rain, you see it jump up real quick, and then you see that long tail off as everything drains off the landscape, which those response times are critical in understanding how the watershed responds and what flood generation looks like downstream.
I'd love to talk gadgets.
Sure.
What are some of the variety of gadgets you use? Let's just say just for soils and water.
Okay.
Or the confluence of those two.
All right. Let's start with the soils. Our bread and butter is your standard soil sensor. Campbell Scientific makes them, but a lot of manufacturers do. We use a lot of Campbell Scientific gear. It's the CS655. It's a TDR sensor, uses time domain reflectivity. Anyways, it sends a pulse down these rods, and the rate at which that pulse returns, and I might be getting this a little wrong, but it's my understanding, the rate at which that pulse returns is correlated to the water content. And these sensors are widely used and have gone through multiple iterations through Campbell through the years. But we have, I think, about 175 of those in the ground around Pepperwood. The vast majority of those are these water content sensors, those CS655s by Campbell Scientific. And for that many sensors, I think they're in 42 locations across the preserve. I should know. I put them all out there, but it's been many years and many holes. And they're in stacked arrays. So it's not just put a sensor in at 15 centimeters and call it good. They're at 15, 30, 50, and 100 centimeters. So having them like that, you can say a whole lot about how is water, soil hydrology, how is water moving through the profile? What's the infiltration rate? And certainly you can look at things like porosity and saturation. It's kind of a proxy. But ultimately, at the landscape scale, the watershed scale, you can say, hey, how much water are we storing in this sponge, the soil, here in this watershed? So it's an important term as far as the water balance goes.
So most of your soil sensors are also moisture sensors. It's really
Correct.
The moisture of the soil that you're the most concerned about. Are there other elements of the soil or other aspects of the soil that you're also gathering data on?
Yes. So we have a few of these out there, and I've gone through the calibrations to make them work, but I'm not an expert. They're called heat dissipation probes. So, all right, I'm going to try to do my best to explain this one. These heat dissipation probes measure, with the calibration, the matrix potential of the soil. That is, how tightly is the soil holding on to the water? Because things are competing for that water. The soil's holding on to it, but also the trees are trying to extract it with their roots. And if you can visualize the analogy here, you have a sponge in your hand and it's sopping wet. Well, at first, you can wring out the water in the sponge. It drips, 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 drips. You wringing that out, that's a lot like the roots pulling on that water, utilizing that water. But eventually, no matter how hard you wring that thing out, you can't get another drop to come out. But you can still feel that it's wet. You know there is still moisture there. And so these heat dissipation probes tell you the matrix potential or how tightly the water is being held by the soil. And so this will tell you things like the permanent wilting point or field capacity, these thresholds that have been determined where plants can no longer uptake water, which is a really important thing for phenology and just response in the ecosystem, and certainly gets onto fire danger because now the trees are really stressed because they don't have enough water, they can't get to it. So we have a few sets of those out there. But like I said, they take a big calibration process, and I've gone through it. And part of that calibration process requires some pretty fancy equipment, which I didn't have. So I worked with tech support to, hey, how do I make this work? So I kind of did the low budget version of that, but I really wanted to go through the process and learn. So anyways, that's a pretty cool data set we have out here.
Well, and that paints a picture for me a little bit of what your job entails. It's not just putting sensors out. I mean, I'm sure that the installation process is substantial, but once you've installed them, you're collecting data and you're analyzing it. But in between that, there's an incredible amount of maintenance and recalibration that goes into it, right? So the ongoing maintenance is a big part of what you do.
Honestly, the installation process, I love because it's brand new, it's clean, you can take your time, get it perfect. And yes, you have to dig the hole, but that's okay. I like working hard and breaking a sweat at work. But the ongoing maintenance, especially when you start to add up 42 locations all over the preserve, 175 sensors, and they're all buried. So if something goes wrong, now you get to evaluate, do I dig this up? Or do I just dig a new hole and put a new sensor in at that depth? And so, I often say it could be a full-time job just to watch these data streams. Yes, it comes back in real time most of the time, but you still have to see it and look at it and go, oops, that doesn't make any sense, or that sensor is not responding correctly, and then dive deeper to evaluate that problem. So if you scale that up by 175 sensors, the maintenance required and the dedication to watching the data, looking at the data. And certainly we've made lots of efforts, can we set up thresholds within our databases that would then alert us or notify us, but
there's only so much you can automate.
Yeah, and sometimes there's seasonal thresholds in soil moisture, right? You could certainly have 60% volumetric water content soil moisture in the wintertime. And so if you set your threshold there, but in the summertime, you would never expect to see that around here. And so it gets pretty complicated. How do you, pre-process and filter that data coming in and have flags thrown your way or email alerts or something's weird about this sensor. So we work on that, but it's still, the maintenance is a huge part.
Hydrology and the availability of moisture for plants and animals is such a crucial element in an ecosystem. We could have gone on discussing it all day, but I didn't want to forget about the other equally important environmental metrics that Ryan monitors, so we branched out to discuss some of those.
There's a whole lot of physical characteristics of soil like bulk density or particle size that, soils kind of in the young range are 10,000 years old all the way through 1 million years old. But certainly, I often think hundreds of thousands of years old to develop and become what they are today. And so I feel confident in measuring bulk density, especially in our forested environments where we're not grazing or there's not a whole lot of impact. There's fire on the surface, but you're unlikely to change bulk density or porosity or particle size. You're not going to change
in the course of a year or 10 years or 1,000 years.
We have those data sets. I've done it for 90 locations across the preserve, things like bulk density and particle size. We have the equipment to do it. But I feel pretty confident you could do that once and you're
That's not an ongoing process. Yeah. The way that water and hydrology is maybe more of a dynamic system that needs you to keep your eyes open, so to speak, your sensor eyes. Great.
Yeah. Let me throw in one thing there. The soil carbon question. We have long been after the carbon question. And because we graze and we do a lot of restoration plantings with native perennial grasses with deep roots, and we even use fire, you may be able to change carbon in the shorter term, but it's such in small concentrations that it's brutally hard to measure, and you need like super precise equipment. Like, we're not going to have that, but you could partner with different agencies. Perhaps the universities like Davis has some cool instruments. That's so I'm fessing up the gap in our knowledge. That carbon question has been on the top of my mind for 7 years, and people have brought it up like, oh, we should do this, especially with respect to our paired grazing.
Getting above the soil, what are some climate elements that you're measuring?
Sure. All right. So weather stations, there's not exactly one definition like what all goes into a weather station, because there's all kinds of different sensors that you could add on there. The standard stuff like temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, precipitation, like those are always top of mind, and everyone can kind of figure out what those are. But things like barometric pressure or incoming radiation, and partitioning that radiation into different spectrums, like the photosynthetically active, your PAR radiometer. So, what really defines a weather station?
Well, what defines our weather station?
Our weather station. So I like to tell people we have 5 full weather stations out there, and they're your classic weather station. They're out in the open, so they're not obstructed by tree canopy, which is important. So things like wind speed and direction and precipitation, you can't have a tree over top of you, because it's going to obstruct that, and you're going to get these weird turbulent values that aren't really showing the dominant wind patterns or the true rainfall amounts. So we have 5 of those, and they're stratified across the preserve, sort of in these different regions. But what they do is they get at different topographies, different aspect, and different elevations, which is nice, because we've seen through all those rain gauges in those 5 different locations, we have vastly different amounts of rainfall, even over short spatial distances. Given the topography here, the top of the preserve is kind of the mountaintop. So we have this rain shadow effect where on the leading edge of the preserve, you may get as much as 30% more rainfall than you do right over here at the Dwight Center behind the mountain. We've cited a lot of those measurements to represent, first, like, certainly at the watershed scale, we want to represent the whole watershed. And a lot of times watersheds are split between aspects because they have hydrology, a creek running right down the middle. So this canyon that might be north and south facing. So we try to represent the landscape with our weather stations. So we have 5 of those. And then we have what I call these micro MET. MET's short for meteorology, or weather station. It sounds fancier. We have 15 of those deployed in these long-term vegetation plots. Now, they're vegetation plots, so they're under canopy. So it doesn't really make sense to do things like precipitation, although through fall is important. It's just really difficult to measure. Wind speed and direction is not there, and solar radiation, which once again, you could make an argument like, well, it is kind of important for the herbaceous understory, how much sun makes it through the canopy. We don't do that, but there's an opportunity there. So we do measure temperature, relative humidity, leaf wetness, an indicator perhaps of fog or dew generation. And at all those locations, we also measure soil moisture. And this time, that soil moisture is right there in the root zone of the forest. So, a pretty critical piece to our network of soil moisture sensors out there.
Excellent. So you got those weather stations, big and small. Can you tell me about the flux towers?
Yes. All right. Yeah, I knew you were going to go there. Those, in the simplest of terms, I tell people, and especially if it comes to permitting them, because it's a tower, right? I tell them, like, no, it's just a tall weather station.
All right.
Play it down a little bit. And when I say tall, as you know, they're 75 feet tall, which is way up there. But a lot of it is similar stuff. Temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, and direction. We also measure solar radiation there. We use a net radiometer. So that's your different components, your incoming shortwave, your incoming long wave, and your outgoing shortwave and long wave. And so you get a balance of like, where's the energy going, into the system or out of the system? But the flux part, all right, and this is what really sets these apart and makes them more than that weather station for the permitting office. There's 2 sensors up there paired together that give the flux tower its name. They're measuring the flux. In this case, it's water vapor and CO2. So there's an infrared gas analyzer that shoots an infrared laser between 2 mirrors, and it measures the density or concentration, they get at both of them, of water vapor and CO2 in the air. If you pair that with a 3-dimensional anemometer, so this device measures wind speed and direction, so every velocity possible. So you pair the concentration of gas with the velocity the air is moving, and you do that 60 times a second, 60 hertz. You can then calculate how much water, in this case, for this paired study, we're looking at water vapor as a product of evapotranspiration. So we can talk more about that, but we're looking at how much water is exiting the system or coming out of the system, and that's a critical part of the water balance. So let me pause. So let me explain this one. Evapotranspiration, essentially the uptake of water by trees and plants, the forest, they're using water. So they're an important part of the water balance. Byproduct of evapotranspiration, when plants open their stomata to take in CO2, they release H2O, water vapor, into the atmosphere, and that's directly correlated to their water use. And so that water vapor moving through these turbulent eddies, eddy covariance flux tower, passes our sensor, and we measure it. And so that's how it gives us an idea of this biological component of the water balance. Hopefully that sticks. It's even...
No, it's incredible. I'll probably sit with it for a little while. I love it. No, but that's a beautiful description. Thank you. Wow. Okay. Thank you for giving us a little bit of a tour through your gadgetry. I know that I'm sure we didn't catch everything, but that's a pretty good representation. How do you think that having this data is going to impact the kind of work we do in the long term?
All right. So it's my dream, and we talk about this, specific to how it impacts our work. So that back to that adaptive management plan, those stream gauges and the flux towers and a lot of those soil sensors are part of this paired watershed study. One of the watersheds we treated, that was a lot of thinning work and then followed up with prescribed fire, like a broadcast burn to clean it all up. And the other watershed was a control, which is relative, like it has a fire history, it's seen grazing, but for the term of this 5-year project, we didn't touch it. We just left it alone. So it's our control, finger quotes. Like I said, trying to put the numbers to the management, the hypothesis is here that if you get in there and you thin out a bunch of these trees in this over-encroached forest full of more dug fir than you would have had historically because we've suppressed fire for hundreds of years, right? Those trees all represent straws in the bucket. They're utilizing more water within the water balance. Our input is precipitation. It's fixed. Whatever rainfall we got into the system, that's our input. And then from there, it gets partitioned into stream flow, soil moisture storage, or deep recharge if it gets below the root zone, and certainly forest water use, evapotranspiration. And so by removing some of those trees, you reduce evapotranspiration and you shift the water balance away from forest use and back into stream flow. And that's, it's very important for our riparian areas, which are these like critical refuges of like cool, moist things when we get into, late summer when it's hot and dry. And so we know exactly how many trees, what biomass we took out, what prescriptions we used in implementing that stewardship. And the hope and the idea is that we can actually see what that means in the numbers. Did we increase flow this year by X thousands of gallons or acre feet, whatever unit you want? And so because we have these things set up for the long term, you can see that impact year 1, and then you can see year 2 and 3 and 4. And as the forestry grows, in theory, all of a sudden you start to lose those, we'll call them benefits, but it's all a natural cycle. You see the water balance start to shift back towards the forest as it regrows, and you see depleted stream flows. And so perhaps in 5, 6, 7 years, you can look and be like, hey, our stream flows are right back to those low levels and our evapotranspiration is way up high again. It's time to implement this management again. So you have this data-informed management and be like, for hydrologic benefit. From another lens here, another angle, we talked about benefits to the riparian area and stream flow. But in all that thinning work, by reducing the number of essentially trees in the forest and the water demand of the forest, now there's more water for less trees. So those trees are not competing with each other as heavily. They're not stressed. They're not as susceptible to fire or pathogen like a beetle infestation. And so it's one of those things where like the benefit is in having mitigated the chance of wildfire. So it's like we don't actually see it because it didn't happen,
right,
which is a good thing. Or if fire does come through, which is totally fine, it doesn't, explode into this huge bonfire of an overstocked forest. It might stay on the ground level and you get this healthy, low intensity burn that just sort of cleans things up. And here's an interesting question too, and I'm not sure I know the answer, but there's a thought too that fewer, and it doesn't mean a few, there's still lots of trees, but fewer larger trees are more efficient at carbon storage than having a whole bunch of little ones.
Okay.
I don't know that for sure, but I've heard that thrown out there, and certainly that's what Pepperwood's management would sort of like lead to is, hey, we're taking out a lot of these small encroached firs, we're lifting up ladder fuels and trying to just reduce the density of stems, within these units.
So all of your data collection together is described as a Sentinel site. Is that correct? That's your position is the Sentinel site manager. So then all the accumulation of all the data streams that you are managing and producing and analyzing is what we call a Sentinel site. Is that accurate?
It's what we call a Sentinel site, and for anyone listening, I'm not stepping on any toes here. It's all an evolving field and definition, but Pepperwood sort of helped define a Sentinel site and early on said, hey, we're going to set ourselves up for long-term monitoring to watch, impacts from a warming climate or changing hydrologic inputs, more severe storms, and certainly fire that follows those changes.
I kind of love it as a term because it makes you picture, a sentinel is like a guard,
yes,
or somebody who's out there on a watchtower. So we're kind of setting ourselves up as a watchtower by watching all of these different elements of the landscape. We're watching what's going on, even as we are impacting it and as impacts that we can't control are happening to it. So we're one sentinel, and we can collect what we want to collect. But I think there is some partnership coming together where we are one of many sentinels. Is that accurate?
Yes. So CDFW, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, has been actively working on defining what is a sentinel site, because although, I've rambled on here for 30 minutes or whatever about everything we're doing at Pepperwood, we are just a drop in the bucket. It's 3,200 acres, but even if you zoom out to the county level, like that's a drop in the bucket. And if you zoom out to the state, you don't even see it. So there's a need, and CDFW recognizes this to like, hey, we need to expand these monitoring efforts across the state because it's so dynamic. You have, the crest of the Sierras all the way to the ocean, Northern California, Southern California, different species and ecosystems and challenges and opportunities all over the state. And so you really want to understand what all those different areas look like, how they're responding to climate change, and what species are there and what opportunities are there. And so CDFW has tried to come up with a standard definition, because it's important if you have all these different areas and people doing this, if they're doing things differently, it makes a comparison or a regional analysis really difficult. And so, it's like from the ground up, like, okay, what metrics do we actually collect? At what time interval? With what instruments? There is so much gained in standardizing those protocols. And one of the challenges I think they would readily, I don't know if admit's the right word, but they recognize it as well. One of the challenges here is like, we need participation. But so how do we make protocols and standards accessible enough that we don't create a barrier to entry so we get the right amount of participation, but we don't want to lower them so much or, put them so low that we're not getting what we need in the quality and the data we need. And so I recognized that early on, and they did as well. And Laura Ward, our conservation science director, now is part of the board with CDFW, and Gary Bucciarelli, who's the chair of the Sentinel Site for Nature Network, working with CDFW. Anyway, so she's tapped in pretty well and has been able to bring a lot of Pepperwood's thoughts and ideas into that process, which has been fantastic. So as, one of the original Sentinel sites, how we define ourselves, we now get to play a pretty important role in helping put together this new definition of the Sentinel Sites for Nature.
All right. Well, you're very generous in you put very strong quotation marks with your body around the original Sentinels. But as somebody who's been at this for a while, you have tried a few things and you figured out some things that work and don't work. So is that something that we're hopefully, through Laura, through collaboration with other people, are you able to sort of offer that as, offer what you've learned to other places that are setting up these Sentinel sites?
Yes, certainly. And the Sentinel Site for Nature Network is leveraging the fact that we're able to do things here at Pepperwood when we have been doing things. We've learned a lot of these lessons. And a lot of their interest is in the biodiversity. So they have a lot of things like cameras and drift fences, and I'll talk about that a bit more. but they kind of want to know what's there, which is a fine question to start.
It's a good place.
You got to know what's there.
And I do know that's part of Pepperwood. Michael Glogly, back in his previous episode, mentioned the fact that Pepperwood as a piece of land is really well studied in terms of like which plants and animals are here, right? Like what is our biodiversity? Would you say that the other sites are also interested in some of the abiotic data that you've been shepherding for a while?
Yes, I think everyone recognizes it's critically important, but things like sensors and weather stations and data loggers come with a bigger price tag and a certain knowledge set to like pull that off and then telemeter it, as in get it back in real time. And also, if you see it coming back in real time, that takes care of most of the maintenance. It's like, oh, it's working. I don't have to go out there, as opposed to like, you don't know. And then you go out there a month later and like, oh, it's not working. That's bad.
Well, something you've already described is the fact that like as these data streams come in, you can't just trust them entirely, like because of the maintenance that's required. So you have to be a little bit constantly skeptical of your data as it comes in and make sure that the sensors are working properly.
Yes.
And that takes, not to embarrass you, but that takes having a Ryan Farrell on staff paying attention to these things and having the expertise to be able to flag these things when they come in. So that is a tough ask. Manpower is almost always a limiting factor.
Yeah.
Right. For any organization, right? You need to have not only a person, but a person with expertise.
Yeah. I do my best, trying.
Of course.
I was very generous. So, yes, CDFW, the Sentinel Site for Nature group and protocol, would like to implement some of these abiotic things. They're just, at the moment, they're just starting real base levels so they can get a lot of people involved. But they have meetings at least once a month, if not every other week, to discuss, hey, what could we add here? And then they bring in experts to talk about it. I've presented to them before, and other people have presented on certain DNA analysis, all about like, hey, discovering what's here. But at the moment, their protocol is pretty simple. It's a traditional game camera, for your medium-sized to larger mammals. It's a drift fence with a downward-facing camera. So, think mice, wood rats, a lot of reptiles, snakes, and lizards, things like that. I've even seen a few skunks poke their heads in there. As these critters encounter this drift fence, they walk along this little plastic fence line, and they go through this, we call it a camera trap. But it doesn't trap them. It
More
just
like a photo booth.
Yeah, photo booth, exactly. They walk through, and then this camera within the box, downward-facing, takes their picture. And so you get that sort of size class of critter. And then acoustic monitoring. There's a critical one, because there's so many birds and bats flying around that you hardly ever see the bats because you're not out here in the dark, and the birds can be tucked away and so small, but you do a better job of identifying them through listening for their different calls. And so in the springtime, during like peak breeding bird time, when they're really vocal, that protocol has you put out these audio recorders. They're audio moths, that's the brand. And listen for 7 consecutive days, a time period of each morning. And then the bottleneck there is now you need experts or AI to listen to those bird calls. And it's a whole chorus, right? There's so many birds layered on top of each other, a little white noise, some other thing running by. And so you have to have the expertise or the right AI algorithms, I'm not exactly sure, to process all that. So anyways, there's a lot of work on the back end of the data collection, and even identifying images. Like, Pepperwood might generate 1 million images a year with our cameras, and we have a small army of interns and dedicated staff to like deal with that. And so trying to figure out, how do we deal with this if we do this all over the state, even if just for a subset of 10 weeks? And once again, you need expertise to like, what critter is that? Or I see the back of this thing, what is that? So a lot of work within the Sentinel Site Network is determining, or is working on the data processing pipeline, and then where you put that data.
So but when it comes to like sort of the current definition of Sentinel Sites and the way that the network is working, some of that abiotic data is still in development, it sounds like.
Yes. The first question, and it's a fine question, is like, what do we have here? What's out here as far as biodiversity in our fauna, our animals? But I always go, wait a sec. If after a year or a couple of years you go, hey, we have less bears this year, why? And you don't have the pieces in place. Like, did you measure anything about the vegetation? Did you measure anything about climatic conditions, your weather? What changed that is possibly influencing the behavior of our animals? And CDFW knows it's a glaring gap. They're like, oh, we need to address this, because, if it just would sort of kills me. Like, you would see the, like, hey, where'd all our bears go? And have no ability to even start to look at that and like answer. You might have anecdotes of like, oh, it felt warmer this year, but until you really have the data there, it's hard to say for certain. And so they're working on that. Like, they're like, oh yeah, we're all going to have weather stations. And like, well, maybe not in this first round. So they recognize it, they're working on it, and they're looking to Pepperwood to help inform that, because for better or worse, we tend to do everything out here. Right. So, we have our vegetation stuff that Michelle heads, and we have the abiotic stuff, the weather station stuff that I head. And they hired 3 folks recently out of college, some of them graduate degrees, postdoc type of folks, to go all over the state in the next couple of years and set up 30 of these Sentinel Site for Nature sites. Oh. And they came to Pepperwood last Friday to see what our setup looks like, because we've already tweaked things just a little bit so that we align with this protocol. And we want to see, what does it look like when you set this up for the long term? And I always lead with like, hey, I've made enough mistakes that I tend to come out a little closer on my first try than others. So
yeah, you've learned how to dodge some pitfalls.
Yeah. Some of them, and I still find new ones. But anyway, so they came out, and that was fantastic. And I think that relationship will continue. And
that's really cool. Well, you say we study everything. Is there anything on your wish list of things that you wish you could add?
Well, the soil carbon one would be cool.
Right.
Especially with respect to our grazing and our paired grassland transects. Mm-hmm. I also have this dream about instrumenting the other watersheds with stream flow, because our management goes around in these circles, like every 5 years. Oh, we're gonna thin and treat the forest over here, and then we're gonna move over here and here and here. So every year we're doing something. It'd be really cool.
Because we have 5 sub-watersheds here, right?
Yeah.
So 2 of them are currently stream flow instrumented. So it'd be nice to expand that. Mm-hmm. I can see that.
Mm-hmm. There's another one I can't quite.
What is remember. That? There's a tower that Laura has talked about.
Oh, the Modus Tower?
The Modus Tower.
Okay. That's part of the Sentinel Site for Nature protocol. But it's kind of like if someone else has a Modus Tower close enough in your region, you don't really need one. Anyways, they put these little, maybe they're pit tags, but anyways, they're little tags, and they put them on birds and bats and sometimes even bugs, believe it or not. And this tower is just a receiver. So if that migratory songbird flies by, it doesn't have to be a songbird, whatever it is, flies by, it pings the tower and says, hey, it's here. And so you can track the migration of these species or the holdover spots or, any of that.
Wow. So that'd be a different set of instrumentation that would help us with those with the fauna that are moving through here.
Yes. Okay. And we are a gap up here. Like the nearest one is down in the Napa-Sonoma Marsh there above San Pablo Bay. But this North Bay region, for whatever reason, there's a hole right here. And so we're like, hey, we can see clear to the horizon, east, west, and north, perhaps even south. Like, we have worked on that for several years. And now with our participation in developing this new Sentinel Site for Nature network, I think it might come true.
It's coming closer. All right.
We put it in a grant, so perhaps. Right.
So a Modus Tower for Pepperwood, it could happen. With every project, or in Ryan's case, the complex collection of many projects that makes up the Sentinel Site, which is his purview, I'm always curious about what supports the work. So I asked Ryan, what makes the work he does possible?
As a nonprofit, we have very little overhead. So money goes towards action more than, everything else. And we don't have a lot of red tape up here. Like, I just talked with a university yesterday. Hey, we want to put fire on the ground. How do we do that? And they're like, they won't let us because all the red tape and liability. And I get it. We live in that world where you just sue everybody. And so the fact that we don't have that here at Pepperwood, and we have all these people that are honestly so good at their jobs, like our coworkers. Devin's a burn boss. Michael knows the landscape so well. Laura can communicate with anyone like she's known them all her life. And I go, how do you know all that? How do you? And then I pull off a few tricks every now and then, and the education staff. Anyways, we're like a highly efficient team here at Pepperwood where everybody like does so much, and their efforts make my efforts easier and vice versa, I like to think. So the team, the low overhead, the lack of red tape makes a lot of things possible. And, and just the morale around here, like everybody's excited and genuinely interested in what we're up to. And I think that carries over into even the grant world when we're approaching possible grantors. Like, we're on the map. Like, people know about Pepperwood. And this track record of doing some very cool, novel things and some cool data sets that, aren't happening anywhere else makes it a pretty attractive place for funders, I think. And if it's funded, then it makes the job easy. So I think that is incredibly helpful in making what we do successful, is that track record and our staff.
Well, that sounds like a nice positive feedback loop that you're describing, which is that the more innovative things that we try, the more capacity we have to try new innovative things that might be beneficial.
Yeah.
That sounds really cool. Well, again, thank you, Ryan, for describing your work. I love hearing about it, and I know we've only tapped the surface of it, so thanks again, and yeah, have a good rest of your day.
Awesome. Thanks, Jules.
Thanks again to Ryan Farrell for the work he does at Pepperwood and for taking time away from that work to talk to us about it. If you'd like to hear more from Ryan, I have great news for you. He's coming back in our very next episode to discuss hunting and how it relates to conservation. So stay tuned to hear his perspectives as both a hunter and a scientist. But this episode is not done yet. It's time for the next installment of the Nature Sound Guess Who game. We play a nature sound at the end of each episode. You have the time in between episodes to guess which animal, vegetable, or mineral made that sound. Please don't hesitate to email your guesses to podcast@pepperwoodpreserve.org or comment on the corresponding social media post, either on Facebook, where we're Pepperwood, Instagram, where we are Pepperwood Preserve CA, or on Blue Sky, where we are Pepperwood Preserve. All right, first let's listen back to the sound from last episode. That sound was made by the California quail. That is specifically an alarm call from the California quail, California's state bird, famous for its adorable black forward-curving plume feather on the crown of its head, which is particularly large and pronounced on adult males. I intentionally chose a vocalization from this species that I was less familiar with. Like me, you may be more accustomed to their advertisement calls or maybe their rally or assembly calls. Let's review all of these calls with some help from the Audubon Society Field Guide to North American Birds, Western Edition. I love hearing how expert birders describe bird vocalizations using human language. The alarm call that we heard is summarized or mimicked using the word pit, pit, or wit, wit. Let's see if we can hear that if we listen back to the recording. California quail advertisement calls are described using the word caw, K-A, and sound like this. Those advertisements are extended into rally or assembly calls, which are described as either cacao-cow, with the second note highest, cacao-cow, or memorably as Chicago, like the city. And that is the sound that I am most familiar with from California quail. Listen into that. All of those calls were recorded by Jeffrey A. Keller and submitted to the Cornell Lab Macaulay Library, who were generous enough to share them with us. There's another sound that I am accustomed to hearing from California quail that is not a vocalization, but which gives me a near heart attack many a time in the shrub habitats of Pepperwood and other Sonoma County open spaces. Have you had this experience as well? Often when I am approaching a covey or a bevy of quail inhabiting a bush or a small tree, probably unknowingly, they explode out of hiding into the air, and the collective sound of their wings beating the air is so loud. It's like a helicopter propeller. Honestly, If I were a predator on the lookout for a quail dinner, the start that noise gives me would be more than enough to slow me down and give those quail a moment to get away. So very adaptive trait. Thanks again to Cornell Lab Macaulay Library for granting us permission to use some of their incredible bird call recordings, including, spoiler alert, the next Nature Sound Guess Who game prompt that you will have until next episode to guess. Listen closely. If you recognize this avian neighbor, send us your guess either at podcast@pepperwoodpreserve.org or comment on one of our social media accounts. You can become podcast famous because if you send in the correct guess, I will shout you out on our next episode. Here comes the clip to guess at in 3, 2, 1. Here's the second chance to listen in 3, 2, 1. So which bird is that? Submit your answers, and maybe you'll hear your name on our next episode. Thanks as always to Stephanie Antonoro, Pepperwood's communications coordinator, for her ongoing support of this podcast project, and thanks to you for listening. Until our next episode, keep your ears tuned into nature.